Sir, stay in the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them.
What's this about?
You match a description. Just stay seated for me.
July 14, 2023. 6:42 p.m. West Kendall, Miami-Dade County, Florida. Lieutenant Marcus Reed, a 17-year veteran of the Miami Police Department, pulls into a private residential driveway on Southwest 148th Court. He is off duty. His service weapon is holstered inside his vehicle. His badge is inside his wallet. His department SUV is parked 2 streets away. A white Ford Explorer with federal plates stops abruptly behind him. Stay in the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them. The voice comes from Special Agent Daniel Harlow of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Harlow is assigned to a joint task force operating in the area. He has been conducting surveillance connected to an unrelated immigration enforcement operation. Reed asks why he is being detained. Harlow demands identification. Reed complies. He identifies himself as a sworn police lieutenant. Harlow requests proof. Reed states his credentials are inside the vehicle. Harlow instructs him not to reach for anything. Within minutes, 2 additional federal vehicles arrive. Neighbors begin recording from across the street. Reed remains seated. Harlow repeats, "You match the description." No warrant is presented. No dispatch call identifies Reed as a suspect. No bolo has been issued with his name. 9 minutes later, Reed is removed from the vehicle. 48 hours later, the footage circulates internally. 6 months later, a civil complaint is filed in federal court. 14 months later, a $10.1 million settlement is reached. The confrontation on Southwest 148th Court becomes the foundation of a federal civil rights lawsuit, one that forces a closer look at discretionary stops, interagency authority, and what happens when power meets power without verification. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. I was told this channel wouldn't reach 1,000 subscribers, but stories like this deserve to be heard. Your support helps bring these cases to light and proves that these stories matter. On July 14, 2023, at approximately 6:42 p.m., Lieutenant Marcus Reed, a 17-year veteran of the Miami Police Department, pulled into the driveway of a private residence in West Kendall, Miami-Dade County, Florida. Reed was off duty. He was not in uniform. His service weapon was secured inside the vehicle. His badge and official credentials were inside his wallet. A federal SUV operated by Special Agent Daniel Harlow of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement stopped behind Reed's vehicle. Harlow was assigned to a joint federal task force conducting surveillance in the area related to an unrelated immigration enforcement matter. Agent Harlow exited his vehicle and issued a verbal command instructing Reed to remain inside his car and keep his hands visible. Reed asked for clarification. Harlow stated that Reed matched the description of an individual connected to an ongoing investigation. There was no active warrant naming Marcus Reed. There was no confirmed bolo identifying his name, vehicle registration, or badge number. The description referenced in the agent's radio communication was general and not uniquely identifying. Reed verbally identified himself as a sworn police lieutenant. Harlow requested proof. Reed stated that his credentials were inside the vehicle. Harlow instructed him not to reach for anything. Within minutes, 2 additional federal vehicles arrived on the scene. At approximately 6:50 p.m., Reed was instructed to exit the vehicle. He complied. He was temporarily detained outside his car while federal agents verified his identity through interagency communication channels. The verification occurred after physical removal from the vehicle. 3 residents from neighboring properties recorded portions of the encounter on their mobile phones. Partial body camera footage from Agent Harlow was also logged. Reed was released shortly after confirmation of his identity. Months later, he filed a federal civil rights lawsuit. The case concluded with a reported $10.1 million settlement. The incident raised operational and structural questions that extended beyond the individuals involved. First, it examined interagency authority boundaries. A local law enforcement supervisor was detained by a federal agent operating within a separate enforcement jurisdiction. The incident highlighted how authority overlaps in field conditions without immediate verification safeguards. Second, the case raised questions regarding identification verification procedures. Reed verbally identified himself as law enforcement. The decision to prohibit him from retrieving credentials while simultaneously escalating the stop became central to later legal arguments. Third, the case tested how federal agents handle encounters involving sworn local officers. Standard practice in many jurisdictions encourages confirmation through dispatch or direct agency contact before escalation when identity is disputed. Fourth, the case highlighted discretionary detention standards under federal authority. The threshold for reasonable suspicion versus mistaken identification became central to legal review. The lawsuit did not focus solely on whether an error occurred. It focused on how the error unfolded, when verification was attempted, and whether protocol required earlier confirmation. This case is structured around layered authority conflict. Lieutenant Reed held supervisory authority within the Miami Police Department. Agent Harlow exercised federal enforcement authority under IC jurisdiction. Both carried institutional backing. The encounter forced those authorities into direct conflict without prior coordination. Harlow's surveillance assignment operated under federal immigration enforcement parameters. Reed's presence in a private residential driveway fell under local jurisdiction. The moment Reed identified himself as a police lieutenant created a procedural decision point: verify first, or maintain physical control. Harlow stated that Reed matched a description. The description was broad. No license plate confirmation had been established prior to the stop. The distinction between matching a general description and confirming identity became central. Under federal authority, agents may conduct investigatory stops based on reasonable suspicion. However, constitutional standards require that the detention be limited in scope and duration. The removal from the vehicle prior to confirmation became the focal point of legal scrutiny. Beyond the direct encounter, the case revealed systemic questions about operational safeguards. Federal enforcement operations frequently rely on rapid decision-making in surveillance environments. The case highlighted whether current protocols require mandatory cross-agency verification when identity is disputed by a subject claiming law enforcement status. Joint Task Force operations combine federal and local officers. However, supervisory layers may operate separately. In this instance, no on-scene supervisor was present at the moment of escalation. Post-incident review occurred after the detention had already taken place. Initial radio transmissions referenced a description but did not specify unique identifiers. The written incident report was completed after identity confirmation. The sequencing of documentation became relevant during litigation. The $10.1 million settlement reflected institutional risk when procedural gaps occurred during field operations. The settlement reportedly included no admission of wrongdoing. However, the financial resolution indicated recognition of potential constitutional exposure. 17-year career with Miami PD. Supervisory rank at time of incident. No sustained disciplinary findings. Authority limited to local jurisdiction while off duty. Evolution. Initially positioned as unidentified driver. Then identified himself as sworn law enforcement. Ultimately became plaintiff in federal civil rights litigation. Reed's role shifted from subject of suspicion to institutional challenger. His lawsuit reframed the encounter as a procedural failure rather than a misunderstanding. 11 years of federal service. Assigned to enforcement and removal operations. Participated in Joint Task Force surveillance. 2 prior conduct reviews categorized as not sustained. Evolution. Surveillance officer monitoring area. Decision maker initiating stop. Field authority escalating detention. Named defendant in federal lawsuit. Harlow's authority at the scene was operationally broad but procedurally reviewable. The lawsuit examined not only his actions, but the training and supervisory structure behind them. Not present at initial stop. Notified post-removal. Conducted internal procedural review. Reviewed body camera footage. Coordinated communication between departments. Evaluated whether Reed violated any departmental policies, none found. Supervisors functioned reactively rather than proactively in this incident. 3 residential neighbors recorded segments of the encounter. No direct participation. Provided independent digital documentation. Videos later preserved and submitted during legal proceedings. Bystander footage corroborated timeline sequencing, particularly the interval between verbal identification and physical removal. The encounter's legal exposure centered on one procedural sequence. Reed verbally identified himself as law enforcement. Agent Harlow prohibited retrieval of credentials. Physical removal occurred. Verification followed removal. The decision to remove before confirmation marked the transition from investigatory stop to civil liability risk. The incident involving Lieutenant Marcus Reed and Special Agent Daniel Harlow unfolded within a framework that had already been tested before. To understand how the confrontation escalated to a federal civil rights settlement, it is necessary to examine prior conduct, procedural handling, structural gaps, and the exact timeline of decisions made on July 14, 2023 in West Kendall, Miami-Dade County. ICE refers to U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Before the Southwest 148th Court detention, Agent Daniel Harlow had been the subject of 2 formal complaints related to aggressive identification stops during enforcement operations. The first complaint involved a traffic-side encounter during a joint task force surveillance operation. The individual stopped asserted lawful presence and requested clarification for the detention. According to internal summaries, Harlow maintained physical positioning near the vehicle door, issued repeated commands, and delayed verification while awaiting backup. The complaint alleged unnecessary escalation. After internal review, the conduct was categorized as within discretionary enforcement authority. The second complaint involved a pedestrian stop near a commercial corridor where an individual claimed Harlow refused to allow retrieval of identification without maintaining a hands-up posture. The detention lasted approximately 9 minutes before verification was completed. Supervisory review again determined the stop was legally defensible and fell within discretionary authority guidelines. In both cases, the central allegation was not unlawful detention, but rapid escalation prior to identity confirmation. Neither incident resulted in formal discipline. Following both complaints, no suspension was issued. No written reprimand was placed in permanent record. No retraining mandate was required. Informal counseling was documented. The counseling notes emphasized situational awareness and officer safety judgment, but did not impose procedural modifications. There was no directive requiring additional supervisory oversight during future stops. There was no evaluation of escalation thresholds during identity disputes. The classification of both incidents as discretionary reinforced operational autonomy without structural adjustment. When the 2 prior complaints are viewed collectively alongside the Reed detention, a consistent operational pattern becomes visible. Rapid escalation during identification disputes. Immediate command posture before verification. Delayed reliance on confirmation systems. Backup requested early in the encounter. Physical control measures introduced prior to identity confirmation. Another repeated element was reliance on visual matching. In each case, suspicion was initially grounded in physical resemblance to a description tied to a separate operation. Verification systems, dispatch confirmation, database cross-check, or interagency callouts, were secondary steps rather than primary safeguards. The Reed encounter followed this same sequence. The removal from the vehicle occurred before confirmation through Miami Police Department records. Several structural gaps allowed escalation without interruption. No supervisor approval was required before initiating or escalating a street-level detention during surveillance. No mandatory dispatch confirmation was required before physical removal from a vehicle. No real-time interagency verification system was activated despite the subject verbally identifying himself as a sworn police lieutenant. No policy requirement mandated temporary pause while credentials were retrieved under controlled conditions. Each of these points represented an opportunity for procedural pause. None were triggered before removal. 6:40 p.m., Lieutenant Reed turns onto Southwest 148th Court after completing personal errands. The area is residential with limited through traffic. 6:42 p.m., an ICE surveillance vehicle driven by Agent Harlow stops directly behind Reed's vehicle. Harlow had been conducting unrelated surveillance connected to an immigration enforcement target in the vicinity. 6:43 p.m., Harlow issues the initial command, remain in the vehicle and keep hands visible. Reed complies. 6:44 p.m., Reed verbally identifies himself as law enforcement and states that his credentials are inside the vehicle. Decision point: Harlow does not permit retrieval of credentials. 6:45 p.m., Harlow requests backup. The request occurs prior to dispatch-based identity confirmation. 6:47 p.m., 2 additional federal vehicles arrive. Visual presence escalates. 6:48 p.m., Reed again requests permission to retrieve identification. He is instructed not to reach for anything. Missed intervention, dispatch or Miami PD verification could have been initiated here. 6:50 p.m., Reed is physically removed from the vehicle. Escalation turning point, removal occurs before identity confirmation. 6:52 p.m., a supervisor is notified by phone. Notification occurs after physical detention. 7:01 p.m., identity verified through contact with Miami Police Department records. 7:05 p.m., Reed is released. Total detention time, approximately 23 minutes, time between removal and verification, approximately 11 minutes. The sequence demonstrates that the decisive action, removal, preceded confirmation. No contraband recovered. No active warrant presented on scene. No written bolo containing Reed's identifying information. No evidence connecting Reed to the surveillance target. The absence of physical evidence narrowed the justification to reasonable suspicion based on visual matching. Partial footage from Agent Harlow's body camera documented. Initial verbal commands. Reed's verbal identification. Backup arrival. Physical removal. The footage did not show immediate dispatch verification attempts prior to removal. Controlled by ICE Field Office Evidence Unit. 3 separate residents recorded portions of the encounter from across the street. Their footage captured. Multiple federal vehicles. Reed seated with hands visible. Removal from vehicle. These recordings were independently retained before being submitted during civil discovery. Controlled by private residents until legal request. Logs show. Backup request at 6:45 p.m. Supervisor notification at 6:52 p.m. Identity verification call logged at 6:59 p.m. The logs provide time-stamped confirmation that identity verification began after removal. Controlled by ICE Communication Records and Miami PD Communication System. The decisive evidentiary element was timestamp alignment between 6:50 p.m. removal from vehicle. 6:59 p.m. initiation of identity verification. This 9-minute gap established that escalation occurred prior to confirmation. In civil rights litigation, sequence determines constitutional analysis. The documented order of actions, command, escalation, removal, then verification, became central to liability exposure. Following the driveway detention involving Lieutenant Marcus Reed and a field agent from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the matter moved from street-level confrontation to formal institutional review. The agency initiated an internal inquiry through its Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR, the division responsible for investigating allegations of misconduct and procedural violations. The OPR inquiry focused on 3 primary questions. Whether the initial stop met the threshold of reasonable suspicion. Whether identification verification procedures were followed. Whether the escalation to physical removal from the vehicle complied with agency policy. Investigators reviewed body-worn camera footage, dispatch logs, written reports, and supervisory communication records. They also examined radio traffic and cross-referenced timestamps to reconstruct the sequence of events. The internal findings did not characterize the stop as malicious or intentionally discriminatory. Instead, the review concluded that the incident reflected what was termed a procedural misjudgment. According to the internal memorandum, the agent relied on a visual match to a suspect description connected to a separate enforcement operation. However, the review acknowledged that verification steps available at the time were not fully utilized prior to escalating the encounter. Specifically, the memo noted that no immediate database cross-check was conducted before removal from the vehicle. No supervisor authorization was requested prior to physical detention. No attempt was made to contact local dispatch for confirmation of the lieutenant's stated identity before escalation. The OPR report framed the event as a failure to apply layered verification safeguards rather than a violation of core enforcement authority. The agent's discretionary power to conduct investigative stops was not formally revoked or suspended in the report's conclusions. After the internal findings were completed, the agency released a public statement. The statement asserted that the agent acted within perceived authority under the circumstances presented at the time. It emphasized the complexity of field operations and the necessity for agents to make rapid decisions during active enforcement activity. The language used in the public statement avoided specific references to verification delays or documentation gaps. Instead, it highlighted the agent's training and service record, the broader operational context of the enforcement task force, the absence of criminal charges stemming from the stop. When the civil case concluded in a financial settlement, the official settlement statement reiterated that the resolution did not constitute an admission of wrongdoing. The language was consistent with standard civil settlement practices, in which liability is resolved without formal acknowledgement of fault. A notable distinction emerged between the internal memorandum and the public-facing communication. Internally, the OPR memo explicitly identified a failure to verify the lieutenant's identity before removal from the vehicle. The document referenced available communication channels that were not used and characterized the verification delay as avoidable. Externally, the public statement did not reference these verification failures. It avoided procedural terminology such as non-compliance, protocol deviation, or policy breach. Instead, it relied on broader phrasing centered on discretion and perceived authority. This divergence illustrates a structural pattern common in institutional responses. Internal documentation identifies operational gaps in technical language, while public messaging focuses on authority, training, and context. Lieutenant Reed filed a federal civil rights lawsuit alleging unlawful detention and violation of constitutional protections. The complaint focused on lack of reasonable suspicion supported by verified evidence, escalation without confirmed identification, failure to employ available verification mechanisms. The case proceeded through pretrial motions, including discovery and depositions. During discovery, body camera footage, internal communications, and the OPR memorandum became central evidentiary components. After months of litigation, the case concluded in a $10.1 million settlement. The settlement resolved the civil claims without trial. As standard in such agreements, the resolution included language specifying no admission of wrongdoing by the agency or the individual agent. The settlement amount reflected negotiated exposure based on litigation risk, reputational considerations, and projected trial outcomes. Following the internal review and settlement, the agent was reassigned within the agency. No public record confirmed termination or formal suspension. The reassignment moved the agent away from active field enforcement into a different operational capacity. No public documentation indicated revocation of federal credentials. The absence of termination suggests the agency categorized the incident as a procedural lapse rather than misconduct rising to the level of dismissal. Supervisory oversight procedures were reviewed within the field office, though no disciplinary findings against supervisors were publicly disclosed. In response to the case, revised verification guidance was circulated internally. The updated guidance emphasized mandatory attempt at identity confirmation when feasible prior to physical removal. Encouragement of interagency communication when a subject claims active law enforcement status. Documentation requirements for situations where immediate verification is not possible. The guidance did not eliminate discretionary stops but clarified that verification delays increase institutional liability exposure. Field agents were advised to document specific articulable facts supporting suspicion and to record attempts at confirmation. The policy adjustment focused on procedural reinforcement rather than structural reform. No sweeping changes to enforcement authority were announced. Instead, the modifications centered on documentation and communication practices. Despite the settlement and internal review, several questions remain unanswered in public records. Why was no real-time verification attempted before escalation? Why were available dispatch channels not used? Why were prior field conduct complaints resolved through informal measures rather than retraining mandates? Were systemic training gaps identified beyond this individual case? These unresolved elements remain part of the institutional record but were not litigated in open court due to settlement. At the center of the case remains a single phrase: you match the description. The phrase initiated the detention. It justified the stop. It framed the agent's perception of suspicion. The moment of removal from the vehicle became the operational pivot point. At that stage, verification had not yet occurred. The delay in confirmation transformed a discretionary stop into a constitutional dispute. Once physical detention preceded confirmation, the trajectory of the case shifted from field encounter to federal litigation. The case demonstrates that discretion without cross-agency safeguards increases institutional risk. Authority alone does not eliminate the need for verification. Rank does not prevent misidentification. The incident shows that documentation determines accountability. Body camera timestamps, dispatch logs, and internal memoranda became decisive not because of interpretation, but because of recorded sequence. The settlement outcome reflects a calculation based on exposure created by procedural gaps rather than contested factual ambiguity. Systems are stress-tested not by stated intent, but by procedural execution. The encounter did not unfold in a courtroom. It unfolded in a residential driveway within minutes. The legal consequences emerged later, shaped by documentation and verification timing. The case illustrates how interagency operations require layered confirmation protocols when authority intersects. Without those safeguards, discretion can convert rapidly into liability. The internal review categorized the event as a misjudgment. The civil litigation categorized it as a constitutional violation. The public statement categorized it as perceived authority. Between those classifications lies the structural tension that defined the case. The opening moment, you match the description, remains unchanged. What followed determined institutional cost, policy revision, and documented precedent. The outcome underscores a measurable principle: operational decisions made within minutes can produce institutional consequences measured in years and millions. Please subscribe to the channel and enable notifications so you don't miss future stories, updates, and in-depth discussions. Thank you for being part of this platform dedicated to examining the facts and pursuing accountability. Until next time, stay informed and stay safe.